A $6 billion bridge sits complete but frozen. Canada paid for it, America needs it, and Donald Trump just threatened to block it from ever opening. When Mark Carney finally broke his silence, his response wasn't just about infrastructure. It was a calculated warning about power, leverage, and what happens when allies start treating shared economic lifelines as hostages. Because this isn't a dispute over construction materials or permits. This is about whether the most peaceful border in the world is about to become a battleground for geopolitical pressure tactics. And if this bridge stays closed, the consequences won't just hurt two countries. They'll reshape how the entire Western alliance thinks about trust, cooperation, and who really controls the arteries of North American commerce. The threat landed without warning and with maximum impact. Donald Trump signaled that the United States could block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a massive next-generation trade corridor connecting Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan. The structure itself is nearly complete. The steel is locked. The cables are set. The roadway stretches across the Detroit River like a monument to continental cooperation. But none of that matters if Washington refuses to authorize the federal permits, customs operations, and security certifications required to move a single vehicle across it. In strategic terms, this is choke point control at its most effective. You don't need to own infrastructure if you control access to it. And right now, that access sits in Donald Trump's hands, being wielded as leverage in broader negotiations over trade disputes, border security demands, and Canada's role in North America's economic hierarchy. What makes this threat so shocking isn't just its audacity, it's the target. The Gordie Howe Bridge isn't some minor crossing or symbolic project. It represents one of the most critical economic arteries in the world. Nearly a quarter of all trade between the United States and Canada flows through the Detroit-Windsor corridor. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in annual commerce, much of it tied directly to auto manufacturing, advanced industry, and energy logistics. Modern vehicle production doesn't happen in single factories anymore. It operates through integrated cross-border systems where components move back and forth multiple times before a finished car ever rolls off an assembly line. A single delay in that flow can stall production across dozens of plants, costing millions per day in lost output. Here's where the power dynamics become even more complex. Canada financed the overwhelming majority of this project. Over $4 billion in public money went into construction, including significant infrastructure built on the American side of the border. Ottawa made that investment for one reason: securing long-term stability for continental trade flows. In geopolitical terms, Canada wasn't just building a bridge. It was buying insurance on North America's economic future, ensuring that supply chains critical to both countries wouldn't remain dependent on privately controlled infrastructure with aging capacity. That decision reflected a specific calculation about sovereignty and leverage. By funding the project, Canada gained ownership stakes and operational control over a vital trade route. But that calculation didn't account for one variable. What happens if the partner nation simply refuses to let traffic move, regardless of who paid for construction? The shock of Trump's threat reverberated immediately through political and economic circles on both sides of the border. In Ottawa, the response required careful calibration. Escalate too aggressively and risk turning a negotiation into a public feud. Respond too weakly and signal that Canada can be pressured into concessions whenever Washington decides to weaponize shared infrastructure. That's where Mark Carney entered the picture. As a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney isn't a typical political figure. He's known less for speeches and more for crisis management, for navigating complex financial meltdowns and understanding how leverage actually works in high-stakes negotiations. When he addressed Trump's threat, his response carried multiple layers of strategic messaging, each one designed to reframe the conversation without appearing confrontational. First, Carney underscored the ownership reality. Canada funded this project with billions in taxpayer money. Any attempt to obstruct it would mean blocking infrastructure largely financed by an ally, raising serious questions about property rights, contractual obligations, and whether shared investments between nations can be unilaterally held hostage for political gain. Second, he reframed the economic consequences. This bridge, Carney argued, isn't just Canada's asset. American steel was used in construction. U.S. workers built significant portions of it. Michigan's economy depends on the trade flows it will enable. A blockade wouldn't just hurt Canada. It would inflict immediate pain on American manufacturers, logistics firms, and workers whose livelihoods depend on efficient cross-border commerce. That framing was deliberate. It transformed the threat from a bilateral dispute into a question of whether America was willing to damage its own economic interests to extract concessions from a neighbor. But beneath the diplomatic language was a sharper warning, one aimed not just at Washington, but at anyone watching this confrontation unfold globally. Weaponizing shared infrastructure between allies risks something far more dangerous than a delayed bridge opening. It damages trust within alliance frameworks at precisely the moment when Western supply chains face unprecedented global pressure. From semiconductor shortages to energy disruptions to the restructuring of trade routes away from authoritarian regimes, North America's economic integration has been presented as a strategic advantage in an increasingly competitive world. If that integration becomes conditional, if it can be leveraged for short-term political wins, then the entire premise of cooperative economic security starts to crumble. Carney didn't say that explicitly, but the implication hung in every carefully chosen word. Once infrastructure becomes a bargaining chip, allies start hedging against each other. And once that happens, the damage isn't easily reversed. What most people don't grasp is how fragile modern manufacturing logistics actually are. The auto industry offers the clearest example. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis don't build vehicles in single locations anymore. They operate integrated cross-border production networks, where a single car might require parts crossing the Detroit-Windsor corridor half a dozen times during assembly. Engine blocks manufactured in Windsor get shipped to Michigan for machining, then back to Ontario for installation, with transmissions and electronics following similarly complex routes. This isn't inefficiency, it's optimization, a system designed to maximize specialization and minimize costs by leveraging the strengths of facilities on both sides of the border. But that optimization creates vulnerability. Delay the flow of components even briefly, and assembly lines stall. Production schedules slip. Delivery commitments get missed. Within weeks, billions in economic activity can freeze as inventory backlogs cascade through the entire supply network. The Gordie Howe Bridge was designed to prevent exactly that kind of systemic failure. The existing Ambassador Bridge, privately owned and operated, has served the corridor for decades, but faces capacity constraints and lacks modern border processing infrastructure. During peak periods, commercial traffic can face significant delays, creating exactly the kind of bottlenecks that disrupt just-in-time manufacturing systems. The new bridge offers expanded lanes, advanced customs facilities, and dedicated truck routes designed to keep commerce flowing smoothly even during high-volume periods. From a logistics perspective, it represents critical redundancy in a system where a single choke point can trigger continental economic disruption. That's why the threat to block it carries weight far beyond symbolic politics. It strikes directly at the operational reliability companies depend on when making long-term investment decisions about where to locate facilities and how to structure supply chains. There's also a quieter power shift embedded in this entire situation, one that helps explain why this moment matters beyond the immediate dispute. For decades, cross-border trade in the Detroit-Windsor corridor depended heavily on private infrastructure, specifically the Ambassador Bridge, owned by the Maroon family. That private ownership created a monopoly dynamic where a single entity controlled access to one of North America's most critical trade routes. The Gordie Howe Bridge fundamentally changes that equation. It introduces publicly governed capacity into a corridor that was effectively controlled by private interests, redistributing both economic and political power over how trade flows and who profits from it. Control over trade routes means influence over tariffs, tolls, and traffic patterns. Influence over those factors shapes industrial geography itself, affecting decisions about where companies build plants, how they structure logistics networks, and which regions benefit from manufacturing investment. In that sense, this bridge isn't just new infrastructure. It represents a restructuring of continental commerce authority, shifting power from private monopoly toward public oversight and binational governance. If the bridge opening were blocked or significantly delayed, the consequences would cascade with frightening speed. Auto manufacturing would absorb the first shock as companies scrambled to reroute shipments through already congested crossings, driving up costs and creating production delays. But the disruption wouldn't stop there. Logistics firms would face higher freight expenses and longer delivery times, costs that get passed through supply chains and ultimately to consumers. Energy exports would slow as refined products and petrochemicals face bottlenecks. Agricultural shipments would back up, particularly perishable goods operating on tight timelines. Insurance and freight pricing would spike as markets price in new risks associated with cross-border reliability. And legal disputes would almost certainly erupt under continental trade agreements, with Canada potentially seeking damages over obstructed access to infrastructure it financed under the assumption of cooperative operation. The economic damage would measure in the billions within the first year alone, with longer-term effects on investment decisions and supply chain resilience potentially dwarfing those initial losses. But the diplomatic fallout could prove even more consequential than the economic damage. Using shared infrastructure as negotiation leverage fundamentally reframes the nature of U.S.-Canada relations. For generations, the relationship has been characterized by cooperative integration, a recognition that deeply interconnected economies benefit both nations, and that trust enables efficiencies impossible in more transactional relationships. If that framework shifts toward viewing shared infrastructure as tools for extracting concessions, the psychological foundation of the alliance changes. Trust becomes conditional. Investments get hedged. Long-term planning incorporates political risk that previously seemed unthinkable between neighbors with the longest undefended border in the world. That shift wouldn't just affect this bridge or this dispute. It would ripple through every aspect of binational cooperation, from defense coordination to environmental management to research partnerships, as both nations begin operating with the assumption that shared assets might be weaponized during future disagreements. So what happens when the infrastructure holding North America's economy together becomes just another piece on a geopolitical chessboard? And can the alliance survive once that line gets crossed? The bridge stands ready. The investment has been made. And now the world is watching to see whether cooperation or leverage defines the future of North America's most important economic relationship. Mark Carney's response wasn't just a defense of Canadian interests. It was a carefully calibrated warning about what happens when allies begin treating shared infrastructure as bargaining chips rather than mutual assets. Because once that precedent gets set, once it becomes acceptable to hold critical trade routes hostage for political concessions, the damage extends far beyond a single crossing or a single dispute. It reshapes how nations think about trust, how companies evaluate supply chain risk, and whether the integrated economic systems that have driven North American prosperity for decades can continue operating under conditions of conditional cooperation. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is its timing. Global supply chains are already under immense pressure from geopolitical competition, technological disruption, and the ongoing restructuring of trade relationships away from authoritarian regimes. Western allies have repeatedly emphasized the strategic importance of economic integration as a counterweight to that instability. But if the United States and Canada, two nations with the most stable and cooperative border relationship in the world, start weaponizing shared infrastructure against each other, what signal does that send to the rest of the alliance? The Gordie Howe Bridge was supposed to represent the future of continental commerce, a publicly governed asset built through cooperation to ensure long-term stability. Instead, it has become a test of whether that cooperation still holds meaning when political pressure intensifies. The concrete may be set and the structure may be complete, but politically, this bridge is still being negotiated. And that negotiation will determine far more than when traffic starts flowing. It will establish whether shared economic lifelines remain safe from political leverage, or whether every investment, every partnership, every integrated system now carries the risk of becoming a hostage in future disputes. Because if this bridge can be blocked, what else can be? If this analysis revealed the deeper stakes behind the headlines, hit that like button now, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the situation is still developing, and the next move could reshape North American trade for a generation. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump will follow through on blocking the bridge? Or is this negotiation leverage that ends with compromise? Share your perspective. The future of continental cooperation hangs in the balance, and you need to understand what's really at stake. It would ripple through every aspect of binational cooperation, from defense coordination to environmental management to research partnerships, as both nations begin operating with the assumption that shared assets might be weaponized during future disagreements. So what happens when the infrastructure holding North America's economy together becomes just another piece on a geopolitical chessboard? And can the alliance survive once that line gets crossed?